well ahead of the legislation and of the police and their resources.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, one of the things that struck me looking at newspaper reports about prostitution recently is that in the past, and I'm sure some of you have read James Joyce and you'll be aware of the Monto, there are areas in Dublin, for example, in the history that used to be very famous as being places where prostitutes worked or operated from, whereas now it's happening in every small town and village around the country, just in sort of easily rented flats, which are then easily moved on from whenever someone thinks that the authorities might be moving in on them. I wanted to ask you, Margaret, about overcrowding and refuges, because this is something that comes up every year. There's an organisation called Safe Ireland, which has done an audit every year of how many women are in refuges, how many women are looking for refuge spaces on a particular day every year in Ireland. And overcrowding is a significant problem, isn't it, Margaret?
I think there's kind of a misguided notion that because Ireland is a Western country and it's well developed, that there are refuges in the country, that therefore people say, well, why couldn't she just go into refuge? And one of the oldest refuges, Rathmines Refuge, I was talking to one of the managers there a while ago, and she was saying that 45 families have been turned away in one day. And even though people will talk about the number of refuges that are there, it's really important to understand the number of bed spaces that are covered. So when you're talking about, at the moment, I think there's 5 refuges, most of those will have 10 family bed spaces. The one in Wicklow has 4 family bed spaces. So for the greater Dublin area, which is the main populated part of the country, we have 1.5 million, and we have, I think it's about 30 family bed spaces. So you can imagine the pressure that means then, because if you're working in the area, you don't want to turn somebody away. Because if you turn somebody away, if you turn a woman away, what is going to be offered her? She's already done something that's different in the relationship, which heightens the level of risk to her. If she goes back home, she's actually at much higher risk than she never did if her partner finds out. If she had never taken that step, the risk would have been maintained. So she has done something which has heightened the level of risk, and so therefore she needs a response. But the alternatives that are offered to her are bed and breakfast. Now, what protection is a bed and breakfast going to offer her? What support is a bed and breakfast going to offer her? The other thing that's going to be offered to her is homeless hostels. And homeless hostels, if you have small children and that, and you are talking about that being an option. Is that an option? Is that what you're going to want to bring your children to? It's extremely difficult for women. And the question that comes up again and again and again is, why doesn't she just leave? But the reality is that the options are very, very small in terms of it. And on paper, there was a recent mapping up by the Irish government that in a sense tried to mask the deficiencies that there are in the system. And that's the thing, that on paper sometimes something can look good. If you look and say there's 50 services in dealing with domestic violence, that can sound good, but all of those will be stretched to capacity. As I said, the same problem that's happening in Dublin is happening all around the country.
Thanks, Margaret. Paula, just in terms of research, and you talked about coming up from the policy end of things, what single or couple of pieces of policy change do you think would make the most difference to the cohort of women that you've studied, homeless women?
I think that access to appropriate accommodation when women find themselves in situations of domestic violence, or at the point at which they have reached a decision to leave their home where domestic violence has been ongoing. However, as we're hearing here, there is a real and significant problem around the kinds of accommodation types available to women. There's also, I think, for example, we have the domestic violence services, with homeless services, which includes bed and breakfast accommodation. In fact, under the European, within the context, if we look at broader and widely recognised definition of homelessness in the European context, the European Observatory on Homelessness has clearly defined women leaving domestic violence as homeless at that point. And I think there is a sort of there's this difficult tension between homeless services and domestic violence services, which isn't uncharacteristic of the Irish context. It has been noted in other jurisdictions, whereby there's a sort of, well, if women are in a situation of domestic violence, that's not a homeless situation, that's a domestic violence situation. But in fact, what we need to recognise is that women who leave contexts of domestic violence they're out of home, they are homeless, and they must be provided with housing. Instead of that, what we can see